I came up with the Eddie Van Halens and Randy Rhoads and Steve Vais of the world, where we were shaving down necks and we were scalloping frets and we were cutting in Floyd Roses and such, because we wanted to do things with these instruments that they couldn't currently do.
I think what he did was despicable, and I would never sell a guitar to that jerk. And I can't now
Well, you won't have a
because
chance
he's
to.
dead. So that's...
Welcome to Life with Strings Attached. I'm your host, Jamie Gale. Today's episode was recorded live in Anaheim, California at the NAMM Show, as part of the 125th anniversary of NAMM within the 10th annual Boutique Guitar Showcase. As part of these special anniversary events, I moderated a 3-part series of panel discussions on the unwritten future of guitar. Our panelists are some of the most influential people in the guitar business today. I hope you enjoy this special 3-part series on Life with Strings Attached. Our first panelist is George Gruhn. Gruhn moved to Nashville in 1969 after getting his bachelor's degree from the University of Chicago and doing graduate work at Duke University and the University of Tennessee. In 1970, he established Gruhn Guitars, which is one of the largest dealers of vintage and used instruments in the world. The Guitar Guru has been a featured columnist for Vintage Guitar, Guitar Player, Pickin', Frets, Bluegrass Unlimited, and he's the co-author of Gruhn's Guide to Vintage Guitars, which is the comprehensive field guide to vintage fretted instruments, and the companion volumes, Acoustic Guitars, and Other Fretted Instruments and Electric Guitars and Basses. Our second panelist is Joe Glaser. Nashville luthier, inventor, and consultant, Joe Glaser's focus on tech and data informs his repair shop, Glaser Instruments, and their software products ShopFlow, GearCheck, and AxFax. Also his business development engineering role as partner in Plek, Music City Bridge, and produces elite parts and tools with the Glaser Bender, OEM, and aftermarket products. Our third panelist is Dustin Miller, a serial entrepreneur and marketer who developed an app for GoPro featured on The James Corden Show, Conan O'Brien, and others. Dustin has worked as a product developer for Amazon companies, including sourcing in China and Vietnam, and has served as a land development marketing consultant for several companies in Chapel Hill and Chatham. He currently is the co-director of 79 West in Chatham Park, a business hub focused on driving growth in Pittsboro and Chatham counties. In his spare time, he's a musician, and he's working on a project and a book with a team of collectors and players focused on vintage 1930s Martin guitars. The first of our 3-part series on the unwritten future of guitar deals with future collectibles. A well-made instrument will last centuries. There are violins that are more than 400 years old still being played today. So what should this mean to the current owner? Are we obliged to consciously steward these instruments into the future, knowing that they will one day belong to someone else? What else should we be considering? Documents? Repair records? Who owned them in the past? As many of the 20th century guitars are being passed from one generation to the next for the first time, there is a multitude of discussions around the authenticity, notable ownership, and provenance. What do we wish we had done differently? And how can we become conscious of the right choices with new instruments being made now?
I think we have a great, broad set of experiences here between the folks we have. And really, I mostly want to know, what is it that you've recently been doing and your current thoughts on how we should care for instruments that will likely last centuries, and maybe what we've learned from ones that we wish we had done differently. Dustin Miller, do you mind starting us off here? I know you've been meeting with collectors around the world, particularly with old Martins at this point in time, documenting those collections, and you're working on some special projects. Dustin, would you please tell me what you think the current status is and what you've observed and what we might do to ensure responsible stewardship for the future?
Yeah, so a little bit about our project. The project has been aptly named Project Dreadnought. We've been at it about 2.5 years, and the team is a fantastic team. Brian Gallup from Gallup School is one of the leads. Joe Glaser is on the team, and Tom Nania from Diodario, and myself. And so for the last 2.5 years, we have traveled all over the country and in a week all over the world looking for the best pre-war 30s Martins in some of the most important collections in the world. And so we've got about 250 guitars that have been cataloged and scanned and photographed and studied, and it's been an amazing experience to be able to work with collectors and dealers and appraisers, and there's a real passion for that American brand of 1930s Martins.
And Dustin, so in doing this work, what have your observations been? I mean, you don't have to be around vintage guitars very long to realize that they've been cared for very differently. Some have been kept in precious condition and others have been barely survived. And so what are your observations about the condition of the current state of guitars that are now approaching 100 years old? And what do you think some of the best practices might have been and what we would recommend for the future?
I think that as the prices of these instruments get into what we often call Stradivarius price levels for American instruments, it's going to change the way that people care for these instruments. And we've just in the last, I think we've seen an evolution of thought around the kind of care that it takes to really preserve these instruments while they're being repaired and restored. And George has been at the forefront of that. Joe's been at the forefront of that. So many people have put in their time. They're more than 10,000 hours to be experts at how to take care of these instruments and preserve them for the next 100 years.
Okay. And are these collections often well documented? Do we know the histories? Do we care? Does it matter that we know the history of them or not? And how does it affect the? I mean, let's say even resale. Is a guitar that has been well documented have a better resale value than a guitar that has not been well documented, or does it matter at all?
Yeah, I mean, Joe can answer half the question, but I would say that we've been shocked. Joe and I have been, and our team, Brian and Tom, we've traveled all over the country, and we've been shocked at the best collections in the world have been managed by spreadsheets and Word documents, and a sort of a hodgepodge collection of ways to manage receipts and provenance, and so I think that there's a shift in how people are going to manage the legacy of these instruments long term.
Okay. Now, Joe, you're the guy who gets guitars when something has gone horribly wrong. Sometimes.
Nobody ever brings something in the shop and says, "Hey, look at my guitar. It's in great shape." But, to kind of talk about what Dustin's talked about, there are millions of violins in pawn shops and schools that if you look inside, they have a label that says Stradivari. And that doesn't mean that it was made 400 years ago. It doesn't mean that it was made by the Stradivari family. And the difference between an $18 or $180 instrument that happens to have some of the trappings of a really valuable, collectible, excellent instrument with a history, the difference is not necessarily a label. It's not necessarily a shape. It's a combination of everything that add up to story. So in looking at the Project Dreadnought, to answer your question a little bit more about value, it's one thing to know that something is really the guitar somebody thinks it is. It's another thing to know that it really has the neck or the bridge or whatever, and people pick this apart. These collectors who can sometimes be sort of over the top picky about it. Oh, the bridge plate's been changed. Oh, the such and such. They put a tremendous value in this. And so what you know and when you knew it and what you tell somebody else and what you don't tell somebody else has a lot to do with collectability. And to that end, as you know, as George knows, Dustin knows, like the violin world, from which we get a lot of these sort of ideas because they've been around 400 years ago. We just woke up 100 years ago and we think that, the world revolves around us. But the violin authentication, for instance, has been going on for years. Right now, there's a startup in Nashville called Vintage Verified that uses a bunch of different spectra analysis. It's a no-touch, no wet chemicals, no chipping off something. But it looks at the spectrum reaction when different bandwidths of light are put on the surface or the plastic or the metals or the woods, and helps a person identify whether the finish that was on a guitar even existed when the instrument was made. And so this is a wonderful bunch of incredible, beautiful guitars. The fact that there's a sort of a Fiesta Red instrument back there in the Mayonas booth is owed to the fact that Fender made this color in the 50s. they're very valuable because it was rare. People are very leery about buying them now because 40% of them might be real and the other 60% have been painted in the last 10 or 15 years. And so unless you have means of authentication to see whether the paint even existed in the 50s or it existed in the 80s, or as it turns out in a lot of these things that they're looking at, the paint didn't come on to 2006. So that's changing. Another thing that's changing is that the record keeping of what happened to something, like these Martins we've been looking at. If you can say that, oh, this guitar doesn't have the original bridge, we're not going to hide anything, but better than that, it's got a bridge made by the great T.J. Thompson or some other great builder. Instead of hiding that and trying to pretend like it's a virgin guitar, which nothing is, by the way, almost no guitar is as clean as people think it is. If you say, well, this was the work done, it's so good, Brian Gallup did it, it's such a good neck set that you would never know anybody did it, but he did do it. So that becomes bragging rights. That's like, okay, this is not only a 1936 D28, one of 4,000 guitars made, by the way, and who knows how many are left, but it's had this treatment, and it was owned by this person, and this other person, and this other person. And so this is sort of leading up to, talking about what we're doing about that.
George, what do you have to say about this?
I got into the guitar collecting as a hobby. My academic background was in zoology. My father was a pathologist. He took me on nature walks as soon as I could walk and talk. And I was learning about the Linnaean taxonomic systems of identification of plants and animals before I was 5 years old. Yep. And I saw my first autopsy before I was 10. Those are the same skill sets that I use today for guitars. But my academic background, University of Chicago, is in animal behavior studies, and then graduate work in zoology at Duke. But I developed an interest in guitars, especially during high school. I had friends who played, and I could look at their instruments, and I could hear them, but I also heard them talking about them. And what I could see is that it was not much different looking at those to identify them than looking at snakes. And I could take some of the identification guide, step-by-step methodology and apply it to guitars, which I did, and I've done that on a number of articles and books. But I also found that guitar collecting is addictive. It's hard to have just one. People often ask me, what's my favorite guitar if I had to have only one? My standard answer is I have one wife, but I prefer a large harem of guitars. And they have different personalities, they're different, and it's almost as though they were alive. Because what the mark of a great guitar is that it has soul and personality, and when you pick it up, you bond with it, and it makes suggestions. It's not simply a compliant tool that can do only what you try or what you ask. The great ones are a musical partner, and they make suggestions. And unlike a high-powered car, you get a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, it may make suggestions, but every one of them is something that's likely to get you in trouble, because none of the suggestions those cars make are street legal. So you'll at least have flashing blue lights or maybe a serious accident. You could total the car, and if you're in the car, you might total you. Or you might even hit a family of 6 in their car and take them out too. Everything you try on the guitar is safe, and if it doesn't work well, you can practice and try it again and again and again, and you can actually perfect it. I've always wondered how the guys do skateboard flips in the air, triple flips and all that. How do they practice that without getting killed? You can practice stuff on guitar and it's safe. But the other thing is you can use the guitar for its intended purpose and it doesn't degrade it. we have guitars. Like Martin's been in business since 1833. I've got guitars from Martin as far back as 1836, and they're still absolutely playable. Some of them we've had to do some setup work, but still they're playable, and they're not obsolete. But you can spend $40,000 or even $50,000 on a very, very, very expensive bottle of wine, but as soon as you pop the cork, you got to consume it because it's going to go bad. And then if you have it, you don't just drink it alone. That would have no bragging rights. So you have to invent. You do a party and you have a bunch of people over, and they each get a sip, and you brag about how much you spent. And 2 hours after consuming it, you pee. And then you have nothing left. The guitar can be used for its intended purpose, and it doesn't degrade to pee or poop. There's a recent article about a tuna fish, 500 and some odd pounds sold in Tokyo at auction, $3 odd million. It's going to be served as sushi. You eat it in the morning, you poop, it's gone. The guitar lasts. But the thing is, since guitars do last, if you don't take care of them, you can ruin them. We don't want to hot rod them to make them into something they're not. When I opened up my shop in 1970, a 30-year-old guitar would be 1940. That could be a herringbone D28 or a D45. It wouldn't be any Les Paul. They hadn't been around that long. But the point is, when Eric Clapton did Derek and the Dominoes on the Johnny Cash TV show, he came in my store in 1970 and bought 4 Stratocasters for $400 each. And then he went around the corner to Showbud and got parts, necks, bodies, wiring harnesses that they were going to sell. And his roadie Newman Jones put things together. They're mix and match parts, which we wouldn't normally suggest now, but Blackie and others came from that. But Strats then were $400 for a good one. Now the guitar could be $50,000 plus. Gibson Explorer, 1970, could be bought for about $1,000. The one Rick Derringer got that had the forked peg head, I sold them for $1,250. Today it would be $1 million. They're good collectibles. They last. You can use them for the rest of your life. But which ones are going to retain value? To me, merit is not always a matter of how much dollars it brings. For example, Stromberg guitars were some of the best orchestral rhythm guitars ever. And in 1990, a good Stromberg Deluxe non-cutaway would bring $40,000, and a cutaway Master 400 would bring $80,000 then. You can't get that now. Prices change. Or F5 mandolins went up 2006. They were bringing 2006 through mid-07 as much as $200,000. Then they went down.
Yep.
Now they're going back up.
Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop is your premier fretted instrument custom case maker, and we invite you to create a musical instrument case unlike any other, one that's unique to you. Every Cedar Creek custom case is hand-built by highly skilled craftspeople using only select woods, Providence Forge hardware, and premium instrument-friendly materials. At Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop, we are dedicated to helping you design the case of your dreams. Find out more at cedarcreekcases.com.
Okay, so this brings me sort of 2 lines of questioning here. One is, I don't think we can really predict which instruments are going to be the great valuable instruments that haven't already been determined something. They go up, they go down, depending on what our future values are. We can't predict our future values today, therefore we can't predict the future value of what the instrument will be. So I think the only thing we can do for responsible stewardship is to simply care for the instruments and care for the documentation. And so, Joe, would you mind telling me, after having to repair so many instruments there, how do you suggest, what are the most important things to make sure that instrument makes the journey of 2 or 3 centuries? Joe?
Well. So as George pointed out, there's pretty well known body of work how you take care of something. You keep it humidified. You touch up glue cracks and all that stuff. That's pretty well known. What George alluded to, which was very interesting, he told the story of Clapton's Black Strat, which is basically just a ragtag bunch of stuff put together. That's not a guitar that's important, except when you look at it in the context of the story of everything where it came from, who did it, what music it played, and what its ensuing lifetime was. So for us, not only do we take care of instruments when they come in, but we try to look at them, we try to look at that repair, not only as the best practices, but how do we keep that in context? How do we keep the story together? How do we take something that's not only an instrument, an example of that instrument, but is an example of somebody's life, their music, the various people who worked on it, and all the rest of that put together. That's really what makes the difference between something that's just a forgotten piece of wood sitting in the corner and something that people are spending $200,000 for, $400,000, or even $30, but making music that's worth, that's worth a lifetime. I didn't answer your question, but that's something I wanted to say.
Okay, Dustin, do you have something?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about the project we've worked on is that it started out as a science project, but then I quickly kind of realized that there was a cultural history that was a part of the value proposition of these vintage instruments. And in our book, we write that America's old enough to have created cool things and too young enough to care. And as I look out in this room and I see thousands of chordophones, guitars, neck-based instruments, it's kind of miraculous that the untold history of this journey of the guitar, 100 years ago, the guitar was not the king of the instruments. It was fighting for its place in culture. And so I think that, to your point, predicting what comes next is hard. But I think that if you don't preserve something now in the present, it's not history until it's recorded. Check. And I think my mic's. Give me your mic. And just to tag that to say that working with some European collectors on Baroque period instruments, they wish that there was data technology 500 years ago that could have been imprinted on these instruments to be able to track the provenance of these instruments. But today we just have provenance and story.
Well, to that point, as we look out here are these incredible instruments by some of the best builders on earth today. And they're new, they're built for an audience that's going to appreciate them, but they're not just an instrument somebody buys. They're a story. They're a story of the builder, of the evolution of the builder. If I look out here and see these various characters standing around here, they've all got a lifetime of doing this. And being able to appreciate what they're doing today, what we're doing today, so that 200 years from now, it's not impossible to look back and understand the story. Because one of the things that's happened in the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s, all the work that was done, all the music that was played on guitars, it might have been recorded. It might have been written down on a little piece of paper. It might have been put in a drawer, and then it's gone. So my particular focus, one thing what we've been working on is we've introduced a collection management software called GearCheck, which compiles photos and history and appraisals and repair histories and all this stuff, because the future of an instrument isn't just who has it today. Nothing lives in just one moment. And again, to look at the famous violins or the famous cars or paintings on the wall, the more you know about them and the more you take care of the knowledge you know about them, and the more you realize that every single thing matters. It's not something, I'll remember that. I'll know what that is. If somebody asks me who did that, I'll be able to say that. This is what we see with these collectors. They've got stuff written on little pieces of paper in a drawer somewhere. This is no longer good enough to take care of all the stuff that we have that we call valuable future vintage guitars. These guys are building future vintage collectible instruments. And it's very, very important to treat them that way and respect them that way. Take the photos. Here's this piece of ketchup wood that I bought. I found it, here I am cutting it up. Here I am doing this. It's all very important stuff. We couldn't do this 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Nobody painted a picture of Amati, sculpting out this violin. But if they had, it would have made that so much more valuable today. Valuable financially, but also valuable right here, which is the reason we care about these things in the first place.
Thank you, Joe. George, you're the one who's involved here in the buying and reselling of instruments. What really is the important information for you to understand, and what do your customers want to know?
It's critically important that the instruments need to be kept to, as close as possible, original specifications. It is true that some instruments owned by famous players, Eddie Van Halen is an example, or Stevie Ray Vaughan, can be really messed up, where if Joe Blow did that, it would be considered, oh, what a shame. But theirs, like Willie Nelson's guitar, he beat the crap out of it, but somebody would pay $1 million for it. But if anybody else did it, they wouldn't. And the fact is, he didn't need to do that. He could have taken any other guitar that would have been maybe less collectible and also used it. I think that it takes only a few minutes sometimes to screw up a guitar irretrievably. And when a great artist does that, even if it was his, it is a limited number of these things that are original. Every time one's modified, it's gone as a vintage collectible. It may be a memorabilia piece, which is a different type of collecting. It's difficult to make predictions about the future because, as Yogi Berra would have said, it's hard to make predictions because it's about the future and it hasn't happened yet. It often enough doesn't happen the way we expect. But I will make one prediction, which may or may not be right, but I think it will be. And that is the ones that will be the most collectible in the future are likely to be the ones that can still be played, that it's possible to have them still be used for their original purpose and be more than only a display piece. You can still play music on a mid-1500s violin. You can still play music on a 200-year-old acoustic guitar. But the new acoustics made right now could potentially last 200 years. But electronic technology keeps changing. The kinds of pickups that we have didn't even exist until the 1950s. And a lot of the new ones today are quite different. Things like having 200 volts in Europe and 120 volt systems here and alternating current. I don't know what they're going to have 100 years from now. Electronic technology could be such.
George,
you'll still be able to retrofit those to make some sound, but the necks and the bodies will last. But I do think that on the electric guitars, 200 years from now, that's a long, long, long time.
All right.
This space is normally reserved for brands who make stories like this possible, like the Dario and the Cedar Creek Custom Case Shop. If your company belongs in this conversation, let's talk. We partner with brands who value craft, culture, and the quiet power of a well-placed idea.
Joe, please respond.
George, I don't think a guitar needs to be played. I mean, I'm sitting here looking at these beautiful Dean Gordon guitars. If one of those things never made a note, they're still beautiful. And what's more, it's better that they sit on a wall and be a beautiful example, almost sort of a fanciful version of a guitar, than to have somebody do what is constantly and often the mistake that's often made, which is that a buyer pays a bunch of money and decides they have the right to have their will over an instrument, scratch it if they want, use it as they want. Sure, they make sound, but nobody plays a painting. We enjoy a painting. Just because this is called a guitar does not mean it's not an work of art. I think the most important thing is to understand what it is and teach people that are around it how to respect it. And I think that's what my focus is these days.
It still works out that there are guitars that are gorgeously ornamented or other musical instruments that are very, very old, and they don't bring as much money as a guitar that is really playable. Like, for example, a D45 Martin from the 30s brings way more money than some of the ones made by C.F. Martin Sr. that cost more money when new, even in the dollars of the day, and they still don't bring as much money. They're beautiful pieces of art. There's lots of marvelously fancy old, even precursors of violins that don't bring any Amatis that are very, very beautiful, don't bring near as much as Strats that sound better.
Well, it does count. It's a good point, George, and thank you. The main part of this conversation, I'm going to try and keep it focused here, is not to determine whether something has a high value or not, or why it does, but simply about the idea that we live in a very impermanent society where we constantly buy and get rid of things. But these musical instruments have a life that could be centuries, and we don't think in centuries terms. I've had these same conversations with architects and the structures we build today, because we're not thinking multi-generationally. My son lives in the city of Strasbourg, France, and the cathedral was built over hundreds of years. The people who started its grandchildren's grandchildren never saw it completed. And so we have a different idea of time. And really what I want to do is bring consciousness to the idea that the guitar will outlive us. And what does that mean for responsible stewardship? Dustin?
Yeah, unfortunately, what we've learned also through this project is that there's survivor bias. So we've been lucky enough to see the best guitars in the world in this category. And guitars are like any other sort of sport competition. There's thousands of guitars in this room, but there's only going to be a handful that make it through the passage of time because they connected with somebody, they impacted people's lives, it was the right pairing of the right person, the right instrument. And so just because you take care of something doesn't mean that it's going to make the passage of time. That's a social contract. You know, what we value is a social contract. And so from my standpoint, why these guitars that we're studying are important is because they're a blending of, they have the utility that George talks about. They're still as functional today as they were in the 30s. They hit such a high mark in terms of tonal quality that defines their success. But they also represent a cultural movement that can't really be obtained again. And so for the future of every guitar that we see out here, these guitars are going to have to hit a cultural moment for people. They're going to have to be socially woven into the fabric for them to last the passage of time.
So there's a question here about a moral imperative, which is interesting for me. The group that I have on the stage today, I think every one of you are entrepreneurs and innovators, but your impulse towards the guitar, from my perspective, is in conservation and the reenactment of a golden year period. Whereas my impulse to the guitar in the first place was not about conservation, but liberation, the idea of new things that could be done. I'm mostly inspired by a guitar that causes me to do something I've never done before, which means I'm not precious about how I treat the guitar. So the guitar I played and toured with for many years was the first guitar that Nick Huber, who's right here behind, has sold in North America. But my Nick Huber has marks on it from where the microphone fell off the stage, from where I kicked it during, I'm a performative player. This is a boutique guitar that has been kicked and has been jumped around and has been thrown against an amplifier for performance effects. To me, I'm questioning the moral imperative of, I bought this instrument because I think it's just a great guitar that I want to play. Is there a moral imperative for me to take precious care of it because it's going to be passed to someone else? Or is the fact that I did some maybe inappropriate things to this guitar a part of the narrative that gives it value in the future? Should we care at all? Convince me that we should, as opposed to live in the moment, that we should somehow conserve it for the future. George?
Guitars with proper care can last hundreds of years, as can art. And if you take something like the Mona Lisa, you know, Salvador Dali could paint a mustache on a copy, but he wouldn't do that on the original. And if you do deface a piece of art like that, you will be greatly criticized. You are the custodian of that art for your lifetime, but in many ways, you are its custodian. I view them as almost alive. And when you view them that way, you don't have a right to mutilate them. If you get angry and you smash a pre-war guitar, most dealers will never sell you one. Martin had the misfortune of one got smashed on a movie set. But you want to talk about guitars that are art pieces that aren't even really meant to be played? Okay, there are people who collect that. But if you were to come along and you were to add more painting to the original artist's painting, that would not be a good thing to do.
As a guitar builder and a player, you have a sense for when something's working right. That's why so many of the world's best trust D'Addario. Unmatched tone, perfect intonation, and strings made to the tightest tolerances in the industry. That reputation is no accident. It's the result of 400 years of being obsessed with quality and innovation. D'Addario, when you know, you know.
What about Eddie Van Halen's Frankenstein? So I came along to guitar in a period where people were pushing the limits. I came up with the Eddie Van Halens and Randy Rhoads and Steve Vais of the world, where we were shaving down necks and we were scalloping frets and we were cutting in Floyd Roses and such, because we wanted to do things with these instruments that they couldn't currently do.
I think what he did was despicable, and I would never sell a guitar to that jerk. And I can't now
Well, you won't have a
because
chance
he's
to.
dead. So that's
right.
as far as what he did.
Joe,
was
what do you?
terrible.
Joe, I think you've been paid to butcher some guitars in some people's opinion. How do you deal with this issue?
I think it comes down to respect. And I've always been conservative. You know, when people, there are various weird ways people were putting frets in with floating them in glue. They were flattening fingerboards on 50s Fenders. We always took a very conservative attitude about that. And something that you can't undo, you don't do. You can always postpone that decision. Now, if you buy a tool, and it could be you could buy one of these instruments and go, okay, it's $18,000 or whatever, but it's my tool. I'm going to beat it to death. I mean, you can kill your dog if you want to, but I think it doesn't show respect, and it's a little bit of hubris to think that, well, it's ours, we can do whatever we want with it. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's not admirable. And if you look at a bigger example of it, you know, look at what we've done to the Earth. We've completely screwed up the Earth. Did we do it knowingly? Yeah. Did we give a flip as a species? No, we didn't. So our history isn't very good on really taking care of things. But if you do take care of it, you do respect it, you do love it, you pass it on to somebody else, you do what George is talking about, which is actually play it at the same time and enjoy it, that's the highest form of humanity there is. If you want to be the lowest form of humanity, you buy something really great, you lay it on the floor, you hump it until it's just a bunch of splinters, and you feel good about yourself. That's the human choice. One isn't better than the other because there is no good or bad, but one's much more respectful. And because if you think about the work and the love that goes into these things, they deserve the respect. They deserve the respect whether they're currently in fashion, like the dreadnoughts we're studying, or whether they're like the ones that George says that, you know, they're really fancy, but nobody really cares about them now. They still deserve respect. And for that matter, the builders out here, they treat their stuff with tremendous respect. They're very, very careful. Cutting edge, not cutting edge. They're very careful. We owe it to them to at least take that seriously before we do something counter to what they were trying to do.
All right, strong statements from George and Joe. Dustin, what do you got to say?
Yeah, and to be the contrarian, this is not my opinion, but this is just a highlight of market forces. So in the vintage world, it's all about supply and demand. And so the counter to this is that if we treated every guitar with loving kindness, we would effectively raise the supply of these instruments. And the reason why some of these instruments are so valuable is because they didn't make the passage of time. And so the rarity is sort of baked in by the idea that they're fragile. People didn't take them seriously. They didn't care about them like they would today. You know, if you bought a guitar in 1937 for $60, no one could imagine in 1937 that a $60 guitar, a $60 D18, would be $150,000 or more. So my thought is that when you're 14 years old and you're doing things that 14-year-olds do, oftentimes the nostalgia that makes you go back and find those things again is that longing for that innocence, that moment that you weren't thinking about things clearly. And I just want to say too, while we're here, George, a big part of this marketplace valuation is people like George have to be present to sort of start the fire. People don't collect things that people don't care about. And at some point, somebody's got to care about it. And then that becomes a cultural moment. And so I just want to say thank you, George, for your total contribution to what I think is the origin of the vintage guitar market.
Well, thank you so much to Dustin, to Joe, to George for coming here today, giving us your precious time and sharing your experience. I truly appreciate your contributions to the guitar, and thank you for being here while we discuss the unwritten future of guitar today.
I thoroughly enjoyed this discussion with my esteemed colleagues. I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. You've been listening to Life with Strings Attached. If today's conversation meant something to you, consider passing it on. These stories find their place through the people who share them. A new episode comes out every Friday, right here, wherever you're listening. I'm Jamie Gale, and thanks for listening to Life with Strings Attached.